Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. The new $61 billion US aid package for Ukraine, approved by Congress on the 23rd of April, will improve, we are told, Ukraine's battlefield position, allowing stocks of ammunition from US bases in Poland and Germany to be shipped quickly to existing Ukrainian forces and newly mobilised troops to be equipped. But what does it really signal to the world? Joining me now is retired US Colonel Douglas MacGregor. Thank you for joining us, Colonel.
Happy to be here.
Colonel, what did you make of the scenes in the House as the Ukrainian flags were waved in apparent celebration of signing the cheque to Ukraine yet again?
Well, I don't think they were really waving flags for Ukraine. They were expressing their gratitude to donors who will reward them for voting for this terrible bill. Probably 60 to 70% of the cash will never reach Ukraine. It'll end up being circulated through the giant laundering machine here in Washington that moves funds to the Department of Defense, from the Department of Defense to military industrial production, to clients, donors, and then eventually parts of it end up back on the Hill in people's reelection funds. So you have to understand that most of this isn't going to have any impact whatsoever on the battlefield in Ukraine. Of course, the Ukrainians are running out of soldiers at this point. They're losing about 500 to 800 Ukrainian soldiers a day, and the Russian offensive hasn't really begun yet. So the place is nearing collapse. But I guess the point is to try and conceal from the American public and from the rest of the world yet again the immense failure of this policy of proxy war with Russia and Ukraine.
How did we get to this point? I mean, I think, those of us that are old enough and ugly enough, we've realised that there's money to be made in a time of war, but that it's so naked now, that it's being pushed now almost as the point of the war in Ukraine. How have we, evolved, if that's the right word, to such a morally bankrupt state of affairs?
Well, I can't speak for what the population or the electorate is like in Great Britain, but here in the United States, I think large numbers of Americans have been very complacent. And by complacency, I mean haven't taken much interest in foreign and defense policy. The average American thinks that if you spend $1 on defense, you get $1 of national security at the other end of the process. That, of course, is nonsense. And they don't have a real feel for how many billions of dollars are wasted on a daily basis by the Department of Defense, or for that matter, by the government. Americans are beginning to figure out that they have no representation in Washington, that the parties are irrelevant. We are supposedly governed at the behest of two parties, but in truth, we have one party. It's called the Uniparty, which is why there were only 21 Republicans who refused to support the bill. So there is no representation. Americans are beginning to figure it out, but there are still Americans who think that the coming election could change something. And you would think by now they would have figured out that it doesn't make much difference who you vote for. You get the same bad outcome.
It feels as though finally the emperor, in the form of the US, is being exposed as wearing no clothes. We've always been sold this idea of the invincibility of the US war machine, and clearly the way events have unfolded in Ukraine must be making it clear even to the most patriotic American that those days are over.
No, I don't think so. I think that there's a great deal of effort made in Washington, D.C. to create the illusion that we are still the great power of 1990 and 91. Now, there are plenty of intelligent Americans who can look around inside our country and realize that the breakdown in the rule of law, the massive invasion of foreigners that no one invited and no one wants, that's evidence for a collapse inside the country. They can see what's happening on the border. So that if you ask the average American, what's your top priority, what do you want to happen immediately, number one is close the border and restore the rule of law. Foreign and defense policy is frankly way down the list. It always has been. If you go back through the 20th century and look at polling data from, say, 1910 right up through the 1990s, Americans were almost always at least 60 to 70% opposed to the use of American military power overseas, especially interventions designed to export our culture and way of life at gunpoint. So that's never been popular. But Americans have entrusted the funding and decision-making to people they thought represented them. Now it's becoming increasingly clear, though not entirely yet, that that's not the case.
Earlier in the show, Colonel, I mentioned the British Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, speaking relatively recently about the war in Ukraine being great value for money, which is a form of words and an attitude that troubles me profoundly. I'll just play the clip, and I'd like to hear your reaction to the tone.
We know that it is right to stop Putin's aggression. We know it's right for our own militaries and our own production bases to ramp up production, not just for Ukraine, but for our own stocks. And as Tony said, so many of the jobs created will be jobs created here in the United States, and indeed, when we're dealing with our own weapon systems, jobs in the UK.
So war is value for money. War is an investment for those who seek to make money. How did we get here?
Well, it goes back to the narrative. Who are the people that had spun this narrative that one day President Putin woke up in the Kremlin and decided that it was a great idea to attack Ukraine? That's a lot of nonsense. We've been working, certainly for the last 10, some people would argue for the last 20 years, to provoke the Russians, to push them into doing exactly what they did. And then they said, well, this was always part of the plan. Well, if it was part of the plan, the Russian army that first entered Ukraine was quite small for the task it had been assigned. And that task was not to go very far, but to try and signal to the West, to NATO, that they were quite serious about not tolerating a threat in Ukraine directed at Russia. Well, when that didn't work and attempts to negotiate with us failed, they built this enormous force. They now have arguably the best, largest, most lethal, battle-tested, battle-hardened ground and air force in the world. And people are saying, well, he's going to attack West even further. Well, he's had opportunities now for months because the Ukrainians have always been weak to move forward, cross that river, and attack all the way to Poland. He's never done it. He doesn't want to do it. So it's a huge lie. Cameron is part of the lie. He's part of that globalist ruling class in Western Europe and the United States that has been doing everything in its power to provoke war. And if you if you don't understand why he's doing it, perhaps you should look into his finances along with former Prime Minister Tony Blair and find out who made them millionaires.
You mentioned, Colonel, the situation on the southern border of the United States. It feels as though the Biden administration has abandoned the very idea of the United States as we have known it, somehow accepting profound or fundamental change to the United States, if not indeed driving that change.
Yes. The people, again, behind the scenes who really control everything, these are the so-called donors. We refer to Washington as donor-occupied territory. It's sort of Epstein Island on stilts, where everyone is rewarded for essentially destroying their own society. And that's what's happening. There is no question about it. They want to denationalize us. And anyone who objects to denationalization is immediately attacked as a bigot, a racist, an anti-Semite, go down the list.
Colonel, I'm just going to jump in at the moment because I have to go to a break, but we'll be continuing this discussion with your forbearance. Stay with us. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. We are discussing the war in Ukraine with US Colonel Douglas MacGregor. Thank you for staying with us, Colonel. Is there more to Ukraine than we are generally led to believe? You know, the determination of the US, of NATO, of so many players to be involved there, to get their way there, Is there something else about Ukraine that we ought to know, but that we broadly don't?
Well, I think we can say the following, that the people that began this proxy war and have poured so much money and resources into it were interested in ultimately dismembering Russia, removing its government, and then stripping Russia of its natural resources, which are considerable, as you know. That has failed miserably and isn't going to happen. So in the absence of this, I think there is a tremendous effort now to do something similar to Ukraine. Now, there are people who are arguing that the Donbass, this area which is historically Russian, that reaches from Kharkiv down south along the coast with the Black Sea all the way to Odessa, is resource rich. That is, it has lots of natural gas, oil, and other mineral deposits. That may be true, but that was not the real purpose of the Russian side. The Russian side simply wanted their people inside Ukraine treated equally before the law. They certainly didn't want a war. Now, in the absence of success for the proxy war to take on Russia, the same people are now looking at Ukraine. We have BlackRock and others in Western Ukraine buying up farmland. Again, some of your viewers may not be aware of it, but a gentleman named Rohrer, R-O-H-R-E-R, I think, a billionaire who lives in New York City, purchased vast tracts of farmland in Russia, Ukraine, Romania, and Bulgaria. And President Putin just confiscated it. And I think there are others who are operating out of New York City and London who are interested in taking over as much of Ukraine as they possibly can, on the assumption that at least the rump Ukraine will survive, and rump Ukraine can then be exploited for whatever assets it's got. This is a terrible situation because nothing is as it seems. Everything is, frankly, connected with this is sinister, Neil, very sinister.
Bear with me, Colonel, while I talk to my guest in the studio here as well, Ingrid Tarrant. How does that make you feel? Nothing is as it seems. The Colonel uses the word sinister to describe what is actually unfolding before our eyes. What, as a fellow member of the reasonable community of Britain, what do you think?
Thank you for saying that I'm a reasonable member of the community. First of all, I am so happy to hear Colonel MacGregor talking like that, because he says it as it is, and he has gravitas because of his history, because of his having been in the military and everything. I agree with everything that he says. This is complete independent thinking. My first reaction to the original pending war between Russia and Ukraine was, this doesn't make sense to me at all. And actually thinking about it for a long time, because in the papers it was threatening it from about October, November, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. They're lining up, Russia's lining up to invade Ukraine. Yes, they probably were lining up, but to me, I saw it as protecting themselves for the pending battle, because NATO knocked on their shoulder and said, would you like to join us? Of course they can't now because they're still at war. And, of course, they were going to say yes, because America wants a foothold. NATO's the dirty word here. To me, it's a four-letter dirty word. And so everything that Colonel MacGregor is saying just endorses all the things that are beginning to play out. But beyond that, Ukraine have got a massive debt. So how are they going to pay it back? They have to pay it back in kind. Also, the other thing I do think about the Donbass and going down to Odessa, there's a protected interest there as well from the West, because I believe there's a lot of nuclear power plants there anyway. So, yes, it's sinister. There's a hidden agenda. We've just got to wake up to it.
Colonel MacGregor, I've previously let you listen to David Cameron, Foreign Secretary. I've got another clip from Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in similar vein, which I'd like to play for you now.
Now, we will have three immediate priorities for this new investment. First, we will put the UK's own defence industry on a war footing. One of the central lessons of the war in Ukraine is that we need deeper stockpiles of munitions, and for industry to be able to replenish them more quickly.
Once again, Colonel, you know, there's the British Prime Minister just really talking. We were sold protecting democracy, standing up for democracy. Now it's just about business and capitalising on investment opportunities, as you were just describing, in terms of the goodness knows what riches and resources Ukraine has to offer, willingly or unwillingly.
Well, I'm not sure it's enough to make any of this viable. I think, at least in the United States, most of us regard the financial system as broken. We all expect a financial collapse. We don't know when it's going to happen, but we know it's coming. There's a very famous gentleman named Nassim Taleb, a very brilliant man who has coined the use of the term black swan. And he has said Armageddon is just over the horizon. He said that within the last couple of months, and people had said to him, well, where is Armageddon? He said, it's over the horizon. He said, well, when is it going to happen? He says, it's going to happen. He said, I can't give you the date and time. We don't know what the trigger will be. But the truth is that, it's not just a sovereign national debt, which is what, 35 trillion at this point, some outrageous number that we can never pay off. It's a whole range of things. We're running a government that is unsustainable, that we can't afford. I suspect that a lot of that is true in Great Britain. So the notion of going to a war footing is utterly ridiculous, particularly since there's no evidence that the Russians or the Chinese or anybody want to go to war with us. If anything, they'd like to put an end to all of it. And whether or not you like them because of their political system is another matter entirely. They're about doing business, and that's what we should be about doing. But instead, we are provoking. And this is what's most concerning. We're engaged from Armenia to Norway in finding ways to provoke the Russians in the hopes that they are going to presumably attack us, which makes no sense at all because it's nothing that they want to do. And we're not interested in escalating anything, yet that's exactly what we're doing. We are escalating day in and day out against Russia. This has got to stop because at some point, the restraint that President Putin has exercised will end. When that ends, we're staring at Armageddon, not just on the financial level, but potentially strategically.
Colonel Douglas MacGregor, I'm going to leave it on that note. It's a pessimistic note, of course, but I think it's wholly opposite. And your tone of voice, listening to you, I find so informative. Thank you so much once again for making time to illuminate us.
Sure, thanks, Neil. All the best.